The committee will come to order. Good morning. Today, our committee will consider measures crafted over the past 2 years by Democrats and Republicans working together to redesign the Internal Revenue Service, protect your private taxpayer information, and prevent identity theft of your Social Security numbers. First, we'll consider a bipartisan package put forth by Oversight Subcommittee Chairman Lynn Jenkins and the Ranking Member John Lewis that boldly rethinks the IRS as we know it. It's been 20 years since Congress and the Ways and Means Committee last considered major legislation to overhaul the IRS. During that time, much has changed, and the IRS must change with it. The bills we have before us today look to dramatically redesign the structure of the IRS and refocus it as a taxpayer-first agency. They advance a modern vision for the IRS so taxpayers are treated fairly, their disputes are handled objectively, and issues resolved quickly and more affordably. They create an independent office to handle taxpayer appeals and ensure taxpayers are no longer at a disadvantage to the IRS. They also insist that the IRS aggressively protect personal taxpayer information, proactively combat identity theft, and be prepared to readily assist American taxpayers when they are victims of this theft. It is our goal, together, to build a taxpayer-first IRS that works for taxpayers, not against them. So thank you, Subcommittee Chairman Jenkins and Ranking Member Lewis, for your work on this important transformation of the Internal Revenue Service. We'll also consider 3 bills in our trade and Social Security jurisdiction aimed at reducing identity theft and fraud. At a time when identity theft and credit card fraud have become so widespread, Congress must do more to ensure that personally identifiable numbers and information held by the federal government is protected. The Moving Americans Privacy Protection Act is a bipartisan bill authored by Congressman Jeff Denham and Congressman Bill Pascrell that looks to put an end to the inadvertent disclosure of personally identifiable information, such as Social Security numbers and passport numbers, when Customs and Border Protection releases certain shipment data. In addition, we'll consider 2 bills that will help better protect our children from identity theft. Children are especially vulnerable to identity theft because they don't work, drive, or establish credit, extending the time an identity thief can use a stolen Social Security card without being noticed. Recently, I learned that someone has fraudulently applied for my Social Security benefits. Regrettably, as so many Americans have discovered, I'm not alone in that attempted theft. The Social Security Child Protection Act, introduced by Congressman Kenny Marchant and Congressman Lloyd Doggett, will require the Social Security Administration to issue a new Social Security number to a child whose Social Security card has been stolen. And finally, Congressman Carlos Corbella's Protecting Children from Identity Theft Act will reduce synthetic identity fraud by stopping fraudsters from creating fake identities by using a real Social Security number and fake name to access credit. So many members off and on this committee crafted the bills before us today on behalf of taxpayers looking to Congress for solutions to the IRS identity theft. Thank you for your hard work and leadership. This collection of targeted bipartisan solutions will help address problems that many Americans struggle with. By passing these bills, we can take meaningful action to improve the lives of all taxpayers. I now yield to Mr. Neal, the ranking member, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before we proceed, the Democratic staff and the members of the committee on the Democratic side, after careful research, have determined that today is your birthday. So we decided to give you a gift that will have lasting consequence, which I, by the way, had to suffer through on the dais here with you. And we know that a good case of your favorite beverage is important, so we've decided that Diet Coke would be an appropriate way to acknowledge your birthday, sir. Happy birthday, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Appreciate it, members. Well, thank you. Thank you.
That'll be gone by the end of the meeting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for scheduling this markup on this important bipartisan legislation on various topics within the jurisdiction of our committee. You and the staff have worked collaboratively with us in putting together these bills, and we appreciate the bipartisanship. The markup is a good example of what we can do when we work together on a bipartisan basis to develop good policy. In fact, I'm a firm believer that some of our best work takes place when we come together. But I also would use the moment as a reminder. Just think what would have happened had we actually had witnesses and hearings on the tax bill. There would have been an opportunity to create, I think, legislation that we would not be compelled to revisit regularly now during the next year or more. But this morning, we will start with a number of bills which would, among other things, strengthen and modernize the IRS, improve taxpayer services, and protect Americans from identity theft. These bills are sponsored by a number of members from our committee, but I do want to single out and applaud the Oversight Chair and Ranking Member Lynn Jenkins and John Lewis, who did hold hearings and met with witnesses to solicit testimony, and they are the principal architects of the IRS redesign package. There are many important reforms in all 9 of the IRS redesign bills we're acting on today, but I'm particularly pleased with the many provisions that would help low and moderate income taxpayers. For example, an important reform we'll be voting on today is to codify the existing free file program under which the IRS partners with the tax preparation community to offer free online tax filings to people whose income fall in the bottom 70%. I'm a longtime champion of the free file program, along with my colleague Ron Kind and others, so I'm pleased that it's in today's package. Another important reform is codifying the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program, under which the IRS partners with nonprofit and community groups to offer income tax assistance to people with low incomes, limited English skills, or other barriers to tax compliance. I certainly encourage our colleagues to support all of these important IRS design bills. We will then proceed to the Moving Americans Privacy Protection Act, which is a common sense piece of legislation sponsored by Representative Bill Pascrell and Jeff Dinham. This bill would strengthen the system used by U.S. Customs and Border Patrol to protect the personally identifiable information of individuals who are moving internationally. I'd like to applaud the leadership of the Trade Subcommittee Ranking Member Pascrell on this legislation and urge my colleagues certainly to support this legislation. We'll conclude today with 2 bipartisan bills relating to identity theft and the misuse of Social Security numbers. The Social Security Child Protection Act, introduced by Representatives Doggett and Marchant, would protect children in cases where their Social Security card is stolen from the mail. Stolen SSNs can be used to commit identity fraud, and such fraud can become quite extensive before the child's family even becomes aware of the problem. Under the bill, SSA would issue a child a new SSN if their card is stolen from the mail. The other bill before the committee, the Protecting Children from Identity Theft Act, is intended to address a growing form of identity fraud, that involving so-called synthetic identity theft. This legislation would allow financial service companies, if they have consent from their customer, to verify the customer's name and SSN with SSA in order to help prevent identity theft. So I'm pleased, Mr. Chairman, that we were able to work together on the basis of strengthening this legislation in 2 key ways. First, we included provisions to ensure that the verification system would be secure and not subject to misuse. And second, we included provisions to make sure the users of the verification system would pay the full cost of it and not detract from SSA's ability to fulfill its primary mission of running the Social Security program. I urge our colleagues today again to support these 2 important pieces of legislation, and we look forward to a productive day. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Deal. Our first order of business, H.R. 5444, Taxpayer First Act. And I'll turn the sponsor of the bill, Subcommittee Chairman Jenkins, to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and happy birthday. I'm pleased we are taking up the Bipartisan Taxpayer First Act today. This bill moves the Internal Revenue Service towards being a truly customer service-focused agency by placing a renewed focus on treating taxpayers with respect and dignity. I've worked on this bill with Ranking Member John Lewis, and I want to take a minute to thank Mr. Lewis and his staff for being so helpful in putting together a truly bipartisan reform of our nation's tax administration agency. Together, we've held 11 formal committee events over the past year and a half, covering many aspects of how the IRS functions, from what it is working on to where improvement is clearly needed. Government certainly needs to work and be responsive to our constituents. As a CPA, you've heard me talk before about my concerns with the interactions of the agency and the taxpayer. Not only have I heard those concerns while practicing in the private sector, but in my congressional office as well. In handling constituent services requests through my office, I have found many instances of just outright lack of common sense in administering our tax code. As we look at what changes need to be made, we focused on the relationship between taxpayer and government by incorporating the latest technology and a private sector-based customer service experience. This means the agency will be focused on the taxpayer to ensure their rights are protected, they are treated with respect, and that the agency is approachable for taxpayers to ask questions and get assistance. That means a customer service experience akin to what Americans expect from the private sector, with online services, callback options, and improved support on the phone. In the era of 5G and broadband internet, it's still hard to imagine why the IRS continues to use technology our children wouldn't be able to recognize. That's why we seek to eliminate fax machines and revamp the IT infrastructure so taxpayers have the peace of mind their most sensitive information is being responsibly protected by their government while using the technology they are used to. We make permanent the IRS free file program, which is not only a win for the taxpayer, but saves the IRS time as well. Additionally, the Taxpayer First Act protects the IRS low-income taxpayer clinics, which are essential for those who can't afford a tax professional. This includes making the Volunteer Income Tax Assistant Matching Grants program permanent to guarantee underserved populations access to quality professional tax return preparation help. Moreover, to make sure taxpayers receive a fair and impartial review of disputes, we established an independent Office of Appeals. This commitment to fair and impartial treatment is the bedrock of the faith Americans place in the IRS. In short, this is the reform we promised our constituents and reforms that all Americans deserve. I look forward to marking up this legislation and seeing it head to the floor soon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Jenkins. I'll now turn to Mr. Lewis, original co-sponsor of the bill and ranking member of the subcommittee for purposes of his opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Happy birthday. Yes, I noticed that Coca-Cola,
where did it come from?
It probably came from Georgia for my district. And if you need more Coca-Cola, we can supply you with more Coca-Cola. Diet Coke.
Yes, sir. Radical.
Mr. Chairman, I'm proud to join Chairwoman Jenkins in introducing the Taxpayers First Act. This bill improved the independent appeal process, taxpayer services, and enforcement. It also makes common sense update to the IRS and tax court structure. This is a good and timely bill, and I hope all of our colleagues will support it. I would like to begin by thanking Mr. Buchanan, our good friend and the former subcommittee chair, for his dedication and commitment to taxpayers. I would also like to thank Chairwoman Jenkins for continuing this good work and sharing her expertise with all of us. So thank you, Ms. Jenkins. Most important, I would like to recognize our staff for all of their good and great work. They work day in and day out to translate what we heard in our hearings and meetings into good policies that will truly improve taxpayer services. Mr. Chairman, for the last year and a half, the Oversight Subcommittee listened, asked questions, wrote letters, and took our time. In particular, I'm very proud of our work to set an income level for the private debt collection program. This provision responds directly to the National Taxpayers Advocate 2017 annual report to Congress. As you know, the program costs 3 times more than it collects. It also targets and abuses thousands of low-income taxpayers by enrolling them in installment agreements that they cannot afford. In my heart of hearts, I believe that the program is a shame, and a disgrace, and that it must end. I'm glad that our bill moves us in the right direction. Through it all, the subcommittee did good work, necessary work. We push aside politics, and we put the taxpayers first. From the beginning, we committed to bipartisanship and we refused to abandon our course. As a result, we wrote a bill that improves tax administration in time for tax day. This is the first time in many years that the committee reached this milestone. The process and the product should be an inspiration to each and every one of us. In closing, I hope that all of our colleagues will support this legislation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. This time I offer an amendment in the nature of substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Barthold, the Staff Director for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide technical description of the amendment in the nature of substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. You have before you 3 joint committee documents, JCX 9, JCX 10, and JCX 11, which describe the underlying legislation, the Taxpayer First Act, the Chairman's amendment, the nature of a substitute, and provides a revenue analysis of the provisions of the legislation. The amendment in the nature of a substitute makes primarily clerical changes, so I will just take about 2 minutes to highlight several provisions in the underlying legislation. As has been partly noted, this legislation would create an independent office of appeals to which taxpayers might take their cases within the IRS. It continues the free file program. It codifies a present low income exception from fees required in cases where the taxpayer enters into an offer in compromise to settle a past tax debt. It limits the seizures of property in cases of structuring transactions and establishes a notice procedure and provides for exclusion from income for any interest that is received in recovering seized property in such transactions. It clarifies the tax court's scope of review and jurisdiction in determination of equitable relief in innocent spouse cases. It provides a temporary income threshold below which cases may not be referred to private debt collection companies. And as was noted, it requires that the IRS create a strategic plan for improved customer service and another report on the redesign of the organization of the IRS from top to bottom. That concludes my brief summary. Happy to answer any detailed questions about the legislation that the members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Barthold. Are the questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Doggett, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think there are some good steps taken in this legislation and the other bills before us. It is a rather unusual process that we're going through today. Normally, a piece of legislation is introduced, other members have ideas to add to it, and the bill grows. In this case, the process was one where a bill was presented as a draft, and now it has been disassembled and split apart into the many pieces that we vote on today, and I assume at some point in the legislative process will be restored as one piece of legislation. Many of the recommendations of the taxpayer advocate that have been presented to this committee and the public through the years are finally incorporated into these bills. One example of that is the provision concerning innocent spouse relief. That is a measure that Mr. Becerra on this committee in the last Congress tried for some time to get the committee to act on. It did not. I offered it as legislation last year and was unable to get committee action on it. I'm pleased to see that it is included today. I don't know how many innocent spouses have suffered as a result of prior inaction, but at least we will see this problem addressed in the future. There are other provisions that the taxpayer advocate has advanced that are not incorporated today that I hope can be considered at some point in the future. I think the bigger consideration of this, or the bigger issue in consideration of this, is to contrast what happened here with a series of bipartisan hearings
that examined how to make modest changes in the way the Internal Revenue System operates and what is happening with the tax law itself. Tomorrow, we are aware, in fact, the process actually begins this afternoon, that something that is known by the misnomer balanced budget amendment will be considered. This is being considered with far-reaching consequences as a constitutional amendment without having any hearing today or at any other time in the committee regarding the impact that this committee's action on substantive tax law has in creating that immense amount of debt. The committee chose to follow the leadership of the king of debt, President Trump, in passing legislation that adds trillions of dollars to our debt. It did not have a hearing in taking that action, and it has not had a hearing since taking that action in considering what the consequences are. With the same pattern with the balanced budget amendment, as it's called, no public hearing with regard to that amendment and the far-reaching effect that it will have were it adopted on Social Security and Medicare, two vital programs within the jurisdiction of this committee, and yet the committee has not explored it, and of course no other committee has explored the impact of that amendment on those vital programs for retirement security. There are also many questions concerning whether the tax law lives up to the promises that were made last year in a process that never had a single member of the Trump administration come here and defend and be held accountable and respond to questions about the bill. I have posed a number of those questions to the Treasury Secretary when he was here. He has still not responded to questions that this committee needs to be exploring, such as whether the addition in the conference committee of special tax treatment never approved in this committee or heard in this committee to lower the tax rate for those at the very top, the top 1%, that one step would be enough to pay for all of the education, financial student assistance cuts that the Trump administration is proposing and still leave a little money available for other things. Nor have we had any exploration of whether the promise is that every American family would have $4,000 to $4,500 in additional household income as a result of this tax bill, whether that is in fact a truthful, accurate presentation of the impact of the bill or not, and of course the tremendous outsourcing of jobs that bill incentivizes is another critical issue. All of these deserve at least as much time as we're devoting today to these modest changes. I yield back, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased that this bill included my proposal to eliminate the failed and defunct IRS Oversight Board. The entity was designed to operate like a corporate board for business. Unfortunately, there were too many members, too many political appointees, and above all, it did not provide proper oversight. Simply put, the board never functioned as intended and has now completely suspended operation. Since I've been in Congress, I have fought to stop waste and reduce the size of government. There's already plenty of oversight when it comes to the IRS, from Congress to the Treasury Inspector General for tax administration. Clearly, the failed IRS Oversight Board no longer serves a purpose and deserves to be eliminated. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for including my proposal in this bill. I look forward to helping the committee reform the IRS and hold the agency accountable and put the taxpayers first. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Dr. Davis, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I applaud the Taxpayer First Act for its prioritization of taxpayer needs. In particular, I appreciate your leadership to prevent private debt collectors from pursuing tax collections
from individuals and families earning under 250% of the federal poverty level. I was deeply disturbed by the report of the taxpayer advocate that found that private debt collection enforcement this year targeted SSDI recipients and SSI recipients, subjected impoverished Social Security recipients to levies, and put 45% of the studied taxpayers into installment agreements they couldn't afford. This program appears to have increased the profits of debt collectors at the expense of the disabled retirees and impoverished, counter to IRS policy and decency. Creating an independent appeals process, improving the offer and compromise program, and modernizing the IRS are overdue improvements. So I commend Ranking Member Lewis, Chairman Jenkins, and all of the members of that subcommittee for an excellent piece of legislation. I urge its passage and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Mr. Blumenauer, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate our moving forward. I think this will make a difference for the agency being able to serve taxpayers. But I must note that this comes at the end of 7 years of Republicans being in control in the House of Representatives, where we have systematically under-resourced the IRS. We've slashed staffing levels. We have cut budgets as a Congress under a Republican, just can only be described as an attack on the ability of the IRS to meet the needs of our citizens. I appreciate the warm words that are talked about customer service, but I have been in IRS offices and had members of the staff break into tears because they are not given colleagues and resources to be able to meet the needs, that they can't answer phones, that they don't have the time to give taxpayers simple information, leading to frustration on their part. Now, I'm pleased that in the aftermath of the tax bill, you realize that you can't continue down this path, and that there's been a little bit of increase to deal with some personnel. But they're still dealing with outmoded technology, understaffed. They don't have enforcement personnel who earn far more, 5, 6 times their salary in getting people who are cheating the Treasury to pay up. And I would hope that as we have, I think, a burst of warm feelings, thinking that the IRS may be able to work a little better for taxpayers, I would hope that there would be a little soul-searching about what has been done to this agency. Visit the IRS offices in your district. Talk to the men and women and find out how hard it has been for them to do what you want done for the taxpayers. I think it would be illuminating, and I think perhaps we'd get a little more cooperation in terms of giving them the tools they need to meet the needs of taxpayers. I am tired of having accountants and tax attorneys tell me that they have to tell their clients, yes, you are right. There is a mistake in your favor. You are owed money, or that you don't owe as much as was. But because of the dysfunctionality, the lack of staffing, the lack of resources, we can't work that through expeditiously. It is cheaper for you to take the mistake than pay a professional to weave their way through to solve the problem. To me, that's appalling and embarrassing. And I would hope that in this new era of cooperation to try and strengthen the ability of the IRS to meet the needs of our constituents, that we would all spend some time with the men and women who are in the trenches now, find out how they've been shortchanged, find out how helping them would not only help our constituents, but would actually pay for itself by enabling to make sure that the tax code is implemented fairly and effectively. I appreciate your courtesy in permitting me to share an observation, and I hope that we're able to move forward yet this Congress to meet these problems, to better meet the needs of the taxpayer.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Roscom, you recognize. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy birthday. I'm pleased that this legislation includes the Bipartisan Free File Permanence Act. The legislation is incredibly significant. By partnering with a coalition of private companies, it's able to offer popular tax preparation software free of charge to 70% of taxpayers making under the income threshold. That is $66,000 for 2017 tax filings. Tax season is not a favorite time of year for most Americans, but by leveraging this public-private partnership, we're able to simplify this process dramatically and allow taxpayers to spend time with their families instead of working on their taxes. It's also, by passing Mr. Curbello's VITA permanence legislation, we're providing certainty to all lower and middle income families across the country that they'll never be without help during the tax season. And as an added bonus, the federal government has saved hundreds of millions of dollars due to the decreased costs of processing electronic tax returns. I'd like to thank Chairman Jenkins and Mr. Lewis for their support in this effort, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Sewell, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member for holding this markup, and I'd also like to echo the sentiments of our colleagues in congratulating both Congressman Lewis as well as Congresswoman Jenkins on this bill. This bill gives us an opportunity for us to come together and change the relationship that many taxpayers have with the IRS. Tax season is a very stressful time for millions of Americans, and the compliance burden on the average American and small business owner is unnecessarily difficult. We are taking important steps today to make the tax filing experience more sensible, fairer, and more efficient. For sure, the IRS has their work cut out for them with a new, very long list of major implementation issues that continue to arise because of our recent misguided new tax law. The IRS officials are scrambling to issue guidance, interpret provisions, and triage gapping holes in a law that we will continue to have many economic harms to folks in my district. But today we are making the IRS's job easier by implementing and improving its interaction with the public. We will be making the tax disputes easier to manage, make government more efficient and more transparent, and I think all of that will improve the customer experience. The base text includes the text of a bill that I introduced with our Republican colleague Jason Smith, the Preserving Taxpayers' Rights Act. This provision will introduce process reforms to help the IRS become more efficient and strengthen its ability to provide services to its customers. Our provisions will give taxpayers a legal right to have their case heard by the independent and impartial IRS Office of Appeals to ensure the timely, efficient, and cost-effective resolution of tax disputes between a taxpayer and the IRS. Secondly, it will ensure that the cases the IRS designates for litigation can only be used where the matters involve a tax abuse and affects a large number of taxpayers. Thirdly, the bill will ensure that the use of designated summons that extends the time period for the IRS to assess a tax liability are properly authorized and are only used when taxpayers are uncooperative and refuse to provide information requested by the IRS. And finally, this part of the bill will prevent the IRS from outsourcing federal tax audits of private taxpayers to outside law firms. Again, I want to applaud both Ms. Jenkins and Mr. Lewis for this bill, and I urge its support. I yield back the balance of my time.
Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? If not, Ms. Chu, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to voice my support for H.R. 5444. This bipartisan legislation is an important step in creating an IRS that is user-friendly and meets the needs of our constituents. There are many important provisions here, but I'm most pleased that there is a provision that will temporarily prevent private debt collectors under contract with the IRS from pursuing tax collections against individuals whose incomes fall below 250% of the federal poverty level. During my time as a member of California's Board of Equalization, the only elected statewide tax board in the country, I heard so many stories of families struggling to work with private debt collectors hired by the IRS. These debt collectors were often ruthless in their methods and have even been accused of using illegal and abusive tactics in the past. For example, last year, the New York Times reported that one debt collection agency advised taxpayers to raid their 401ks, ask their boss for a loan, load up on credit cards, and even put their house up as collateral in order to pay overdue tax debt. That's dangerous and unacceptable. What's worse is that these type of tactics are being used the most on low-income taxpayers. In their report released earlier this year, the Taxpayer Advocate found out that low-income taxpayers make up most of the cases given to private debt collectors. Nearly a quarter of the accounts involved taxpayers with below poverty level wages, and more than half were taxpayers with incomes of less than 250% of the poverty level. Overall, we know that private debt collection programs are not even profitable for the IRS. Last year, it brought in little over $6 million in federal revenue, while costing more than $20 million to manage. So while I would ultimately like to see the complete end of the entire IRS private debt collection program, I believe that this bill moves in the right direction by curbing the pursuit of low-income families. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, the nature is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Any chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purposes of offering a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 5444 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill, H.R. 5444 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5444 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. And our next order of business is H.R. 5445, the 21st Century IRS Act. I recognize the bill's sponsor, Mr. Bishop, for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your leadership on this issue and your commitment in making this a priority. One of the most common refrains I've heard from my constituents since coming to Congress is horror stories in dealing with the IRS. And while those situations are not necessarily the norm, I think everyone recognizes that there are areas overdue for improvement. Over the past year, we've had a number of opportunities to hear directly from the IRS as well as from some oversight bodies, including the Taxpayer Advocate, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, and the Government Accountability Office. Our conversations with officials from all of these bodies have been productive and informative for members of this committee as we have drafted this legislation we are considering here today. The main takeaway for me out of most of the meetings that we've had is how severely behind the IRS is in its technology and systems capabilities. We live in a world of constantly emerging threats and sophisticated criminals who are probing and trying to gain access to the IRS and ultimately the taxpayers' information. The 21st Century IRS Act is focused on addressing these issues in 2 main ways. First, the bill will improve the cybersecurity at the IRS and give them additional tools to combat identity theft. Most, if not all, of the members of this panel have heard a distress story from one of their constituents about how they had to deal with their tax refund and that they were counting how they had to deal with a constituent who had a tax refund issue that they were counting on to pay bills or to go on vacation, which was stolen. The IRS, to their credit, has taken the initiative and engaged with states and industries to form a public-private partnership focused on reducing identity theft, tax refund fraud. This legislation will codify that partnerships and provide additional tools to identify trends and schemes as they come about. Secondly, the legislation will modernize the IT systems with the IRS. This includes an important provision that my colleague, Ms. Wolarski, authored, which sets clear guidelines, processes, and responsibilities for certain officers at the IRS as it relates to the acquisition of software and other technology systems. It also includes a provision put forward by Mr. Renacci, which would allow businesses to file their 1099 information through a taxpayer-friendly internet portal. This will both ease the compliance burden for taxpayers and businesses and will allow the IRS to get tax information in a more timely manner, which will improve the quality and accuracy of the security checks. Finally, it encouraged the IRS to rely more on electronic filing and payments, which increases both the speed and accuracy of the administration and will save the agency time and resources. Again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your leadership in this process. This is an important bill that directly addresses a number of issues that have been raised by stakeholders, including taxpayers, tax preparers, the IRS, and the oversight bodies that we have heard from. I urge all of my colleagues to support this bill, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. I now recognize the bill's original co-sponsor, Ms. Dobeni, for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to thank our Oversight Subcommittee leaders, Mr. Lewis and Ms. Jenkins, for their efforts on the important bills that we're considering today. I had the opportunity to visit with constituents of mine who are serving low-income taxpayers in our community through the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program, and I'm very pleased to see that this important partnership would be made permanent by one of the bills that we're considering today. Regarding the 21st Century IRS Act, I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Bishop, for his work with me on this legislation. The bill advances a number of important reforms to enhance cybersecurity and online access for taxpayers, including small business owners. As a former State Department of Revenue director and a technology industry veteran, I know firsthand that coordination between private sector technology experts and tax administrators at the state and federal level can produce real results for taxpayers. We should strive to harness technology to create a more seamless, reliable, secure experience for American families who are becoming increasingly accustomed to conducting their financial business through safe online portals. By codifying things like the Security Summit and the role of the IRS CIO, this bill should create some continuity in terms of prioritizing technology improvements and improving the taxpayer experience. I'm also glad that we're addressing improvements for small business owners, like the development of an online portal for 1099 filings. I know small business owners in my district and across the country are tired of waiting for a more user-friendly, web-based system, and this is a good step for them. We should be streamlining the filing process so that they can spend less time and money on tax compliance and more on growing their businesses. While this bill is clearly an incredibly important step forward, I'd like to share the comments of a CPA who weighed in on the discussion draft of the legislation as a reminder that this is not the end of our work. He said, and I quote, "Finding the funds for technology upgrades is probably the most important issue you are facing, but your colleagues keep cutting the budget, which has been steadily cutting the effectiveness of the IRS for many years. We are at a perilous point where honest taxpayers are extremely frustrated. Fix it quick, or it will become too broken to fix," end quote. After hearing from IRS administrators and others over the past couple of years, I think we may be in or approaching the red zone of becoming too broken to fix. Just like a pothole that would cost $1,000 to fix today or $10,000 to fix tomorrow, we need to be making smart investments in IRS technology today before they become increasingly insurmountable and expensive tomorrow. Around 64% of IRS hardware is aged and out of warranty, and 32% of software is 2 or more versions out of date. Systems that the IRS relies on to store taxpayer data are failing, and there are serious concerns that they could break down or fail to withstand a cyber attack. These are not issues we can let fester any longer. Let's build on the progress we're making here today to get those systems modernized and really get the job done for American taxpayers. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Delbenny. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5445. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time, I offer an amendment in the nature of substitute, which is distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Bartold, the Chief of Staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment, the nature of substitute, with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have before you three joint committee documents, JCX 12, JCX 13, and JCX 14, which describe the underlying legislation, the 21st Century IRS Act, provide a revenue analysis of the provisions in the Act, and a description of the Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. The Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute makes clerical changes. I will briefly highlight seven areas of significance in this legislation. The legislation requires study and recommendations to prevent identity theft and refund fraud. It permits the IRS to share information with state agencies and the private sector with respect to identity theft and refund fraud and efforts that might be made to combat those. It requires the IRS to explore expanding electronic payment systems. It establishes within the IRS a chief information officer and directs that that individual develop a strategic plan for the IRS's information technology needs. It requires the development of new online services for taxpayers, such as those mentioned with respect to filing Forms 1099. It further limits disclosures and redisclosures of return information to third parties to keep control on taxpayer-protected information. And it would expand the use, required use of electronic filing by corporations. Under present law, corporations that make 250 return filings under present law are required to file everything electronically. This legislation would reduce that threshold down to 10 by the year 2021, so that more businesses would be required to make electronic filings. That's my brief summary of the bill. Happy to answer any detailed questions about the legislation that the members might have.
Thank you, Mr. Bartold. Are there questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like the innocent spouse protection that the committee finally acted on with the last piece of legislation that had been pending here for several years, this bill also includes a provision that Mr. Becerra sought to have the committee act on in the last Congress that I sought last year through H.R. 3340 to have the committee act on that I think is important. And that is what Mr. Barthold referred to concerning a disclosure of tax information. There are situations such as when someone applies for a mortgage that they are asked to sign a request for a transcript of a tax return. The lender can gain access for up to 4 years of tax returns for use in evaluating the mortgage application. And there's some other similar situations. The taxpayer advocate pointed out years ago that there are not the same restrictions and limitations on disclosure of that information that apply in other situations. So this follows the provisions recommended by the taxpayer advocate to protect privacy concerns. I'm pleased that the committee is finally acting on it. This committee has shown an unusual interest in protecting the privacy of President Trump's tax returns, and finally we see action to protect the tax information in the returns of those that the taxpayer advocate recommended we address years ago, and I'm pleased to see it included in the bill. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Renacci. You recognize strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a CPA and someone who has been a victim of identity theft, I applaud moving this legislation. I'm also glad to see that the 21st Century IRS Act includes 2 bills I introduced this year, along with a number of provisions resembling concepts from a bill I introduced with Representative Lewis over the last 2 sessions of Congress. First, protecting taxpayer confidentiality through Safeguards Act, which I introduced last month, will limit redisclosure and unauthorized uses of tax return information. With limited exception, it is universally agreed that tax returns and tax return information should be kept confidential. However, present law does not adequately require that a recipient of such information strictly maintain its confidentiality. Accordingly, the IRS taxpayer advocate recipients can currently share the information with affiliates, publish it, and even sell it. This legislation would crack down on such behaviors and further protect taxpayer confidentiality. Second, the Creating an Online Platform for Instant 1099 Submission Act, also included in a larger package, would create an internet platform to simplify and expedite filing of Form 1099s. This legislation makes it easier for businesses to file 1099 forms while also getting tax administrators the data they need in real time. Not only will this give the IRS more time to seek out tax fraud, but will be free to filers. Finally, the Stolen Identity Refund Fraud Prevention Act, which I introduced last year with Representative Lewis, is resembled by provisions in Title I in this bill. These include provisions establishing an information sharing and analysis center, along with other language to increase government collaboration and information studies of how to better respond to identity theft fraud. I sincerely appreciate how seriously the chairman, his staff, and all of my colleagues are working to combat identity theft. I encourage support for this legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Renacci. Dr. Davis, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Identity theft is one of the major issues confronted by the Chicago taxpayer advocate. Helping to prevent identity fraud and helping taxpayers to deal with theft is very important. And for those reasons especially, I support this legislation, urge its passage, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Chairman Black, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And having drafted the original 1099 platform in 2015, I'm really proud to see that this policy is finally making its way toward the finish line. Special thanks to my colleagues, Ms. Representative Renacci and Bishop, for the good work in this space. This bill would accomplish 2 goals. First, it would make it easier for a small business to file the 1099 form. And second, this bill will help to prevent tax fraud, which is so important for our constituents. The Social Security Administration for years used a platform that allowed employers to upload W-2s. Businesses praised this system because it greatly simplified the filing process. Generating Form 1099 costs money and consumes time. The new platform, H.R. 5377 the platform that it creates will reduce the burden of the time and cost while improving how businesses interact with the IRS. Also important, this bill would reduce the chances of tax fraud. It is expected that more businesses will take advantage of this new system and that the IRS could process more forms in a timely manner, saving taxpayer dollars. The IRS would then be better able to match up the data from an individual return with its corresponding 1099. This cross-matching would reduce the likelihood of fraud. Again, I want to thank the committee and my colleagues, Mr. Renacci and Mr. Bishop, for their efforts to advance this policy, and I want to thank Chairman Brady as well for working with us on it. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentlelady. Yields back. Ms. Walorski, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to rise today in strong support of the 21st Century IRS Act. Over the course of numerous hearings on the IRS over the past year and a half, one thing has become abundantly clear. There's a big trust gap when it comes to IRS procurement of information technology products. I've highlighted many instances where the IRS wasted money on IT systems. They've bought products they couldn't use. They've handed out contracts that should have never been handed out. They've embarked on major projects without a clear sense of direction, leading to cost overruns and long delays. Take, for example, the Return Review Program, or RRP. It's a new fraud detection program that replaced legacy systems but came in years behind and hundreds of millions of dollars over budget. It's a long saga, but I want to highlight one episode in particular because it encapsulates so well the problem the IRS faces more broadly. The RRP was put into a strategic pause in 2014. The IRS cited many reasons, but here's a few. They paused to determine the priority and direction from IRS senior leadership, to articulate and align on RRP's role in the broader business vision, to ensure clear and concise understanding of scope, cost, and schedule with contractors, and finally, budgetary constraints. It's easy to see why this project had overruns and delays, and it's plain to see why they ran into budget constraints. Everyone ran around in circles with little or no direction until they ran out of money. This cannot happen. Whether it's a $7 million contract for Equifax just weeks after the company disclosed the largest data breach in history, or hundreds of millions of dollars in cost overruns for RRP, it's clear that we need to drastically improve coordination and accountability at the IRS to prevent this waste of taxpayer dollars from happening again. I recently introduced H.R. 5362, the Information Technology Accountability Act, and I'm thankful that it was included in this underlying bill that we have before us. My bill takes a few important steps to prevent future waste and instill accountability, including codifying the role and responsibilities of the IRS Chief Information Officer, or CIO, requiring the CIO to develop, implement, and update a multi-year strategic plan for the IT needs of the IRS, and requiring coordination between the CIO and the Chief Procurement Officer. It also singles out 2 IT projects for independent verification and validation: the Customer Account Data Engine 2, or CADE 2, and the Enterprise Case Management System, or ECM. Like RRP, these 2 projects are highly significant and will replace legacy systems. Unfortunately, they're also like the RRP in that they're years behind and over budget. The IRS has been working on CADE 2 for almost a decade and spent over $1 billion, and it's still years from completion. And the ECM, which was supposed to be used agency-wide, has been suspended because the software the IRS procured could not be used agency-wide. By requiring independent verification and validation for these 2 projects, hopefully we can identify what's causing the delays and overruns and put them in a better trajectory for completion. The IRS faces a clear trust gap. Every time the IRS blames a problem on lack of funds, I recall that list of reasons for the RRP strategic pause, because that list goes beyond money. More money can't fix failed leadership or a lack of communications. More money can't fix a broken culture. Better guidelines, codified roles, and more intentional strategic planning can. I'm glad we're taking this step towards closing the trust gap. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, as well as Chairman Jenkins and my colleague, Mr. Bishop, for all of your hard work on this bill. I urge my colleagues to support the 21st Century IRS Act, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Rice, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Brady, thank you for holding this markup today so that we can take the next step in restructuring the IRS into a modern agency that adequately serves the American taxpayers. When this committee began to formulate our plan for tax reform, our goal for the tax code was to be fair, simple, and modern. We wanted our tax code to work for the American people instead of against them. As we proceed with this legislation as part of the largest IRS overhaul in 20 years, we should draw on these same principles to ensure our tax administrator works for the American people. Filing taxes should be straightforward and simple, and taxpayers should be fairly treated by the IRS. I believe this legislative package achieves these goals and will help return the IRS back to the people. I'm happy to see that the Electronic Signature Standards Act legislation I introduced last year with Representative Kind is included in this package. The IRS needs a uniform system to collect electronic signatures. Electronic signatures are widely used. Electronic signatures are widely used today
and the IRS has stubbornly refused to have uniform standards. This legislation would fix this problem by requiring the IRS to issue guidance establishing uniform standards and procedures for the acceptance of commercially provided electronic signatures on disclosure, authorization, and power of attorney forms. This is a simple, free, private sector option for small businesses and electronic and individual taxpayers to comply with the requirements of our system. This will simplify the filing process for taxpayers who depend on this commonly used technology and enable the IRS to move forward with the secure filing option they already support. Additionally, let me say that today's markup and this legislation cannot and should not represent the entirety of our work as it relates to modernizing the IRS's information technology. This committee and Congress as a whole must hold the IRS accountable in their efforts to modernize their ancient IT infrastructure. There are too many examples of the IRS wasting money, missing deadlines, and ultimately failing to meet the needs of taxpayers because of insufficient systems. The IRS today has over 300 points of failure, which means that there are 300 different systems being run by the IRS, that the technology is so old that only one person knows how to keep these systems running. And when that person retires or passes on, we have real trouble. So it's absolutely necessary that we move into modern technology. In order for any entity, including government entities, to be successful, they need to modernize, and technology is the base of their customer service mission. The IRS, whose customers are 140 million individual taxpayers, should be no exception. As we've heard from witnesses who have testified before this committee on multiple occasions, the IRS simply does not have the information technology infrastructure in place to competently function as our nation's tax administrator. The IRS has a long way to go to fulfill their obligations as our nation's tax collector in a cost-effective, customer service-oriented way, but today's legislation is a big step toward achieving that goal. I look forward to continued efforts by this committee to modernize the IT infrastructure at the IRS. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this legislation before us. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any amendments to the amendment in nature of substitute? If there are no amendments, questions on the adoption of the amendment in nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. In chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 5445 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill, H.R. 5445 is amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5445 is amended, is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 2901, the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Permanence Act. I'll turn to the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Curbelo, to give an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Neal, for bringing this bill, the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Permanence Act, before the committee today. And thank you, Congressman Davis, for being my partner on this legislation. The Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program is a matching grant program administered by the IRS where the federal government partners with the local community to provide free tax preparation services to individuals with an annual income of less than $54,000 and for those with a limited proficiency in English. Tax return preparer fraud is a major problem in our country, and South Florida knows this well. The IRS consistently ranks preparer fraud among the most prevalent tax scams in their annual report. Each tax filing season, fraudulent preparers take advantage of taxpayers by claiming inflated expenses, false deductions, or unallowable credits on their client's return. They attract more business by promoting larger refunds and may even siphon off the tax refund to their own accounts. Then, when the IRS detects a false return, the tax preparer and not the return preparer is liable for the additional taxes and/or penalties. Unfortunately, it is those on the lower end of the income spectrum and those who struggle with English that are the prime targets of fraudulent preparers. The VITA program offers a solution to vulnerable populations by not only filing their taxes for free, but doing so with a high level of accuracy. VITA preparers are IRS certified and boast a 94% accuracy rating, which is among the highest of all preparers. The House and the Senate Appropriations Committees have continued to include strong funding for the VITA program regardless of which party is in the majority. H.R. 2901 would build upon this support by permanently authorizing the VITA grant program. Furthermore, H.R. 2901 would ensure that VITA preparers maintain their already strong accuracy rates by requiring accuracy rates above 90% in order to qualify. Filing a tax return can be enough of a headache on its own. Taxpayers should be able to file their tax returns confidently without the fear of being scammed. When taxpayers use VITA services to file their tax returns, they can rest assured knowing that their returns will be filed accurately and without the threat of fraud. Mr. Chairman, colleagues, this legislation will leave a lot of lower-income people in our country better off. It'll improve quality of life for people who want to comply with the tax code. I encourage all the members of this committee to vote in favor of H.R. 2901, the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Permanence Act, which has a proven track record of success in assisting Americans in one of their most basic civic duties, filing their taxes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cabello. I'll now turn to Dr. Davis, original co-sponsor of the bill, for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I thank Chairman Jenkins, Chairman Brady, Ranking Member Lewis, and Ranking Member Neal for advancing the VITA Permanence Act. I thank Congressman Cabello for his partnership and leadership in championing this crucial program that provides high-quality tax help to hard-working families so they can keep more of their hard-earned money. I also tip my hat to Senators Brown and Heller, former Representative Mike Honda, the United Way and Prosperity Now, for their leadership on VITA performance. The Volunteer Income Assistance Tax Assistance Program, or VITA, offers free tax services to people who make less than 250% of the poverty level and to underserved taxpayers, including persons with disabilities, the elderly, and limited English speakers. It is a prime example of smart federal investment because each federal dollar is matched by the private sector. And I especially thank the United Way of Metropolitan Chicago for its participation. The demand for VITA services is great. The number of tax returns prepared by the VITA program doubled between 2014 and 2016. In 2016, VITA grantees filed more than 3.8 million returns, helping families claim about $1.1 billion in earned tax benefits. In Illinois, over 23,000 returns were filed for almost $32 million in refunds. With the new tax law, these high-caliber in-person services are needed even more, especially in states like Illinois, affected by the SALT limitations. VITA services are top-notch. The IRS reported that VITA preparers have a 94% accuracy rate nationally on returns claiming the Earned Income Tax Credit. Further, VITA services make a real difference for individuals and families. VITA sites are skilled at ensuring that taxpayers get all of the tax benefits for which they are eligible. These savings, coupled with the savings of hundreds of dollars in tax preparation costs, put more money in my constituents' pockets to cover essential costs like rent, groceries, and medical care. H.R. 2901 makes important changes to the VITA program. For example, in addition to permanently authorizing VITA, the bill allows the Secretary to fund the VITA grants up to $30 million. We have fully exhausted the recent appropriations of $15 million. Given the high demand and need, H.R. 2901 recognizes that IRS should put taxpayers first by giving them access to high-quality, free services, doubling our federal investment via this quality matching grant program. And as I close, I want to recognize the tremendous work VITA grantees in Chicago, the Center for Economic Progress, and the citywide tax assistance program via Ladder Up. As these programs do, many VITA sites provide additional programs to increase financial stability for our families. I'm grateful for their presence in Chicago, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. We'll now proceed to consideration of H.R. 2901. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time, I offer an amendment in nature substitute which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in nature substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Bartold, the Staff Director for the Joint Committee on Taxation, provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask the members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 15, which describes the underlying legislation, H.R. 2901, and JCX 16, the chairman's amendment, the nature of a substitute, which replaces H.R. 2901. Under present law, under present practice, the Internal Revenue Service has maintained a volunteer income tax assistance program. This legislation would codify that program and provides that the Secretary, unless there's a specific appropriation stating otherwise, may allocate from otherwise appropriated funds for taxpayer services up to $30 million per year in matching grant programs. I note that the Consolidated Appropriations Act for 2018 funded the IRS with slightly over $2.5 billion for taxpayer services and required that no less than $15 million of those funds should be allocated to the VITA program. This legislation also establishes requirements on matching grant recipients, such as established measures for quality control in their programs. It establishes priorities for the IRS in awarding grants to different recipients. That concludes my brief summary of the legislation. Be happy to answer any specific questions that the members might have.
Thank you, Mr. Bartold. Are there any questions about the amendment, the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Doggett, you're recognized.
Well, I think this is helpful legislation. We know that as important as the Earned Income Tax Credit program is, that about 1 in 5 of those who are eligible for the Earned Income Tax Credit do not claim it. This program, VITA, I know our colleagues have mentioned how it helps in their part of the country. In San Antonio, the United Way, Catholic Charities, the City of San Antonio have been able to secure a significant number of volunteers, including many retirees with professional experience, to help people, and have added a significant amount to the local economy through the VITA program. Similarly, in the Austin area, Foundation Communities, I work with almost the entire time I've been in Congress in trying to see that we reach out to more people in the VITA program there where it has a similarly good effect. So I believe that this will be a helpful addition to the code to actually give a statutory authorization for the VITA program and encourage all the local voluntary efforts. It will have a practical effect on VITA only if an increase in the $15 million level is approved. So it is really important, since this is already in the appropriations bill, that we act now in the current budget process to ensure that that $15 million amount goes up and that dollars can go out to groups like the United Way, Foundation Communities, and other nonprofits that are doing a good job to reach out and try to get to some of those individuals that are not claiming the Earned Income Tax Credit now, making them aware of the services and helping them avoid some of those who really prey on the working poor and take so much out of their income tax refund that they have little left to show for it. And this VITA program, which provides free tax assistance, is a way to solve that problem. Hopefully this legislation and an appropriation will allow it to reach even more, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pascal. You recognize strike last.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this particular program has proven to be more effective at reducing errors in tax filings than the many unregulated tax preparers who set up shop, charge fees with no oversight whatsoever. In fact, they have an accuracy rate of 94%. I think that's pretty darn good. So we want to make this permanent, this program. I just visited Mr. Doggett mentioned it, but I visited a United Way in my district that used the volunteers from this program to help my constituents file their taxes. And if they see if they were eligible for the EITC and the CTC, many people are not coming forth. They don't know they're eligible. Those two programs are great for taxpayers, the EITC and the CTC. The principal anti-poverty programs, I think, of our time. The number of tax returns prepared by VITA continues to grow every year. So to millions of Americans, this service is extremely critical. This bill will make permanent the IRS matching grant program, which provides grants for developing and expanding tax preparation programs across the country for low-income and limited English-speaking communities. Now's the time to make this important program permanent. I urge a yes vote. And by the way, this program also has a lot to do with people feeling part of the community and part of the system. And that's why I recommend the passage of the legislation. I'm a proud co-sponsor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Pascal. Ms. Chu, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to voice my support for this bill, the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Permanence Act. It will provide important tax assistance services in my district. In fact, this program is so important to me that I had my office be a VITA site at one point. It was popular and a lot of work, but I did it because VITA provides such an important function for low and moderate income individuals and families and to those with disabilities. However, VITA also has another crucial function, serving taxpayers with limited English proficiency or those that are LEP. This is particularly important back home. In my area of the San Gabriel Valley of California, nearly 242,000 residents are limited English proficient. VITA programs in the area offer their services in such a wide range of languages, including English, Spanish, Mandarin, Korean, and Vietnamese. These in-language services are critical in assisting LEP families complete their tax returns year after year. The programs that partner with the IRS to administer VITA deserve reliable funding so that these families know that their services will continue to be available. The VITA Permanence Act would codify the VITA program under which the IRS partners with nonprofit and community groups to offer income tax assistance to people with low incomes, limited English skills, or who have other barriers to tax compliance. Since 2008, the IRS has offered matching grants to its nonprofit and community partners, but this legislation would permanently authorize that funding. I'm pleased that this committee has acted in a bipartisan fashion to codify this important program that is so important to many of my constituents, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 2901 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. H.R. 2901 is amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 2901 is amended. It's ordered favorably reported to the House without objection. I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 5440, a bill to require the IRS to notify Congress and the public prior to closing a taxpayer assistance center. This bill provides necessary transparency to taxpayers seeking the assistance of the IRS when an in-person visit is necessary. Face-to-face customer service is an important option provided by the IRS, and when that option is reduced because of the closure of a site, taxpayers deserve to be notified. Now I'll turn to Ranking Member Lewis for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I hope that all of our colleagues will support the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5440. The IRS operates taxpayers' assistance centers in order to provide personal help for taxpayers on a variety of issues. There are more than 350 of these centers across our country. This bill will require the IRS to notify Congress and the public before they close any of these centers. Mr. Chairman, this is a good common sense bill, and I hope everyone will support it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. We'll now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5440. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time I offer an amendment, the nature of substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment of nature of substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Bartold, the Staff Director for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment of nature of substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask the members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have before you 2 joint committee documents, JCX 17 and JCX 18, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. The chairman's amendment makes largely clerical changes. The underlying legislation requires that if the IRS determines to close a taxpayer assistance center, it must publish using different multimedia 90 days in advance announcement of such a closure, and that the IRS also must prepare a report 90 days in advance of the closure to explain the rationale for the closure to the Congress. That concludes my description of the legislation. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bartold. Are there any questions about the amendment in nature substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? There are no amendments. Questions on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Being chair, the ayes have it. An amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 5440 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. H.R. 5440 is amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Being chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5440 is amended. It is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional dissenting, or more minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 5438, a bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code to allow officers and employees of the Department of the Treasury to provide to taxpayers information regarding low-income taxpayer clinics. Now turn to Mr. Holding, sponsor of the bill, for a brief opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, happy birthday, and thank you for holding this important markup, and I appreciate the committee's help with H.R. 5438. This is a common sense bill, allows IRS employees to provide taxpayers with information on low-income taxpayer clinics. Specifically, IRS employees will be permitted to provide program details, including the eligibility requirements to receive assistance from a low-income taxpayer clinic, where the centers are located and how you contact them. It's a practical proposal that will improve taxpayers' experience with the IRS, hopefully. It's a short, sweet bill. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Lewis of Georgia, for partnering with me on this legislation. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your amendment in the nature of a substitute, which will provide that provisions be effective upon the date of enactment. So I urge support for this no-nonsense, common-sense, short bill. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Holding. I'll now turn to Mr. Lewis, original co-sponsor of this short, sweet, concise bill, for purposes of an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I hope that all of our colleagues will support the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5438. I'm proud to join my friend from North Carolina, Mr. Holton, in sponsoring this common sense bill. This bill will allow the IRS to provide information about low-income taxpayer clinics to those who might be eligible. Ms. Lester, Mr. Chairman, just a moment. The main purpose of these clinics is to help taxpayers resolve dispute with the IRS. This bill helps taxpayers receive the support and guidance they need. Last December, the Oversight Subcommittee held a hearing on the taxpayer's experience. This bill responds to one of the many issues raised in our discussion. During the hearing, we heard testimony from Ms. Tamika Lester. Ms. Lester served as the Associate Director of the Philip C. Cook Low-Income Taxpayer Clinic at the Georgia State University College of Law that is located in my congressional district. Ms. Lester and other witnesses shared great ideas to improve the taxpayer's experience. In one of our many great panel discussions, going forward, I hope that our subcommittee will continue to develop bipartisan response to their concern, suggestion, and recommendation. Mr. Chairman, I hope that all of our colleagues will support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. We'll now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5438. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read. Open for amendment at any point. Consider base text for purpose of amendment. Now turn to Tom Bartold, Staff Director of the Joint Committee on Taxation. Provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, you have before you 2 joint committee documents, JCX 19 and JCX 20, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. The IRS currently provides some grants to qualifying low-income taxpayer clinics, but the Department of Treasury prohibits its officers and employees from referring taxpayers to qualified low-income taxpayer clinics for advice and assistance. This legislation would allow officers and employees of the Department of Treasury to advise taxpayers of the availability of the eligibility requirements for receiving advice and assistance for qualified low-income taxpayer clinics that receive funding under the code, and to provide location and contact information. That describes the legislation. Happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thanks, Mr. Bartola. Are there any questions about the amendment in nature's substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in nature's substitute? If there are none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in nature's substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in nature's substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 5438 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. H.R. 5438 is amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5438 is amended, is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business, H.R. 5446, to restrict the immediate sale of seized property by the Secretary of Treasury to perishable goods. When the IRS needs to seize the taxpayer's property to recover a debt, the IRS rightfully has that power. However, to turn and immediately sell a taxpayer's property, specific protections should be in place. The IRS has, unfortunately, used the exception for perishable goods to immediately sell items that are in no way perishable. This is a common sense provision that adds important protections to taxpayers. I'll now turn the original co-sponsor of the bill, Mr. Crowley, for an opening statement.
I thank the chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup today. Specifically, I am pleased that Chair Jenkins and Ranking Member John Lewis included the civil asset forfeiture bill written by Congressman Roskman and myself into the base bill, and I'm greatly appreciative of that, Mr. Chairman. That language has passed the committee and the full House twice already, and hopefully the Senate will act sooner rather than later on that important legislation. I honestly hope that the House passage of the Clyde Hirsch Sowers Respect Act, which would enact vital reforms to the federal government's civil assets forfeiture process, would send a clear message that the abuses in this area would stop. I was hoping we could shift our focus on getting justice for those previously wronged, but that is not the case, because we now have learned, as the chairman has indicated, about the case of Mies Bridal and Tuxedo Shop in Garland, Texas, where the IRS raided the store even though no charges of tax fraud were ever filed. Claiming they owed $31,400 in back taxes, the agent seized $17,000 in cash and approximately $650,000 in wedding dresses and garment-making equipment like sewing machines. Then the agents immediately auctioned them off, all over a tax dispute that is in doubt. The agency argued the expedited procedures were needed because the dresses were, quote, perishable goods, end quote. Dresses are perishable goods? Ms. Black? No comment. In invoking the word perishable, the IRS didn't have to post advance public notice of the auction or wait at least 10 days before selling the goods, as is normally required under the law. To make matters worse, there are reports, and I would say that there are reports, Mr. Chairman, that an IRS agent brought children to watch the raid, and again, it's reported, only reported, that an off-duty officer bought some of the dresses for pennies on the dollar, profiting off that raid. To say if that took place that that's wrong is an understatement, if that in fact did take place. It's egregious and criminally wrong, in my opinion. I've said it before, civil asset forfeiture is an important tool for the IRS, and the chairman agrees. I would dare say that everyone in this room would agree. and other federal agencies use them to go after ill-gotten gains from drug dealers, human traffickers, terrorists, and other criminal elements. As a son of a New York City police detective, I would never want to weaken that vital law enforcement tool. But we need to stop the abuses against law-abiding citizens who are innocent until proven guilty, and claiming that 1,600 wedding dresses are perishable and then immediately auctioning them off to apparently the lowest bidder who happened to be part of the IRS raid is an abuse of power. It is unconstitutional, and with the passage of this bill, soon would be blatantly illegal. I urge swift passage of this bill to help us address the abusive flaws in the civil assets forfeiture process as it currently exists. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time, and thank you once again for holding this important
thank you, Mr. Crowley.
agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Crowley. We'll now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5446. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time, I offer an amendment in nature substitute which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in nature substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, considered base text for purpose of an amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Bartold, Staff Director for Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in nature substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask the members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 21 and JCX 22, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. The chairman's amendment makes clerical changes to review the underlying statute. The code provides certain expedited procedures for the sale of tangible property that's seized to satisfy unpaid tax debts under three circumstances: if the property is liable to perish, if the property is liable to become greatly reduced in price or value by keeping, or if it cannot be kept stored without great expense. The proposal before you would limit the streamlined procedures solely to property that is liable to perish. This would apply to property seized after the date of enactment. That concludes my description. Happy to answer any questions the members have.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Bartold. Are there any questions about the amendment, nature's substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Are there amendments to the amendment, the nature's substitute? If there are none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment, the nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment, nature's substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purposes of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 5446 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 5446 is amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. 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 Those opposed, no. Opinion chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5446 is amended as ordered, favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business, H.R. 5437, require the Secretary of the Treasury to establish a program for the issuance of identity protection, personal identification numbers. I'll now turn the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Paulson, to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just begin by thanking Congresswoman Del Bene for being an active partner in this important bipartisan legislation dealing with identity theft. Members, as we know, identity theft is becoming more and more prevalent, and there are actions that we can take here in Congress to protect taxpayers and their information from identity theft. Each year, scammers steal billions of dollars from hardworking taxpayers by filing false returns. For a criminal, the scam is simple. Steal a taxpayer's Social Security number, file a fraudulent claim in their name, and then collect the refund. For the taxpayer, unwinding this mess is far tougher. It's all too common. In just the first 2 months of the 2016 filing season alone, the IRS identified more than 31,000 of these fraudulent returns. Thousands more surely slipped through the cracks, and a Government Accountability Office report now says last year that scammers attempted to claim $14.5 billion also in the 2015 tax year. And while this is a tremendous theft of taxpayer dollars, it is also a nightmare for victims who must work to clear their name with multiple government agencies and then wait longer and longer to receive their own tax refund. It's a crime that hits seniors the hardest as they struggle to navigate that maze of paperwork and bureaucracy to clear their names. And we owe it to our seniors to do more to protect them from this fraud. There's one measure that we can take to make this scam a little bit harder. It's called the Identity Protection Personal Identification Number, or an IP PIN. An IP PIN is a 6-digit number issued by the Treasury Department to a taxpayer that would change every year and help authenticate a return and then validate the identity of the person filing it. Today, IP PINs are available only to a few select taxpayers nationwide as part of a pilot program. This legislation would allow us to move forward because it is time to expand this program by giving all taxpayers the option of signing up for an IP PIN over the course of the next 5 years. Our bill gives taxpayers peace of mind by allowing them to proactively protect their identities from tax scammers, and it will save taxpayer dollars by preventing fraud that puts refunds into the wrong hands. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for moving this legislation forward today, and I ask my colleagues to support us in actually voting for it as well.
Thank you, Mr. Paulson. Now turn to Ms. Delbene for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleague, Mr. Paulson, for helping advance this important measure. This is a pretty straightforward bill with a straightforward mission: protecting taxpayers from tax identity theft and fraud. I'm sure everyone is familiar with a scheme that some enterprising criminals came up with to file fraudulent tax returns so they could collect money that didn't belong to them. I'm sure it's safe to say that constituents in every one of our districts went to file their taxes only to find out that they'd been filed already and someone else had claimed their return and their identity. In response, the IRS instituted a smart common sense program to assign PIN numbers to affected taxpayers without which they could not file their taxes. These 6-digit numbers would be reassigned each year, and electronic returns would not be accepted without them. According to the American Coalition for Taxpayer Rights, it appears that this program has helped protect taxpayers and reduce fraudulent returns. The number of tax returns with confirmed identity theft dropped 32% from 2016 to 2017 alone, and 57% during the 2015 to 2017 period. Yet, tax identity thieves are still claiming millions of dollars in fraudulently obtained refunds. By broadening the IP PIN program to all taxpayers, instead of only making it available to identity theft victims and individuals in pilot project states, we can be proactive about keeping taxpayers' personal information and hard-earned dollars safe. We can also make further progress in reducing the instances of fraud during the filing season. This is a proven program and a no-brainer, and I look forward to seeing this put in place for all of our constituents. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5437. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time I offer an amendment in nature substitute which was distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in nature substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Bartold, Staff Director for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in nature substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 23 and JCX 24, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. As Mr. Paulson had noted, over the past 7 years, the IRS has maintained a pilot program providing identity protection, personal identification numbers to combat identity theft and refund fraud. This proposal, this legislation, would require that over the next 5 years, the Secretary establish a nationwide program of providing IP PINs to any individual requesting it, and the legislation requires that this program be rolled out state by state every year over the 5-year program. That concludes a brief description. Would be happy to answer any detailed questions that the members might have.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Bartold. Are there any questions about the amendment, nature of substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Any chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 5437 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. H.R. 5437 is amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5437 is amended, is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Any member have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 5439, provide for a single point of contact for taxpayers who are the victim of tax-related identity theft. I'll now turn the sponsor bill, Mr. Renacci, to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this markup. I believe that modernizing the IRS's ability to administer our tax code is a critical next step following the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I'm pleased to see this legislation that I introduced with my good friend John Lewis be considered today. I've worked tirelessly over the last few years with Mr. Lewis, and I want to thank him for his commitment to finding bipartisan solutions to better protect the identity of Americans. Identity theft has become a growing concern in Ohio and across the United States. It is one of the most costly crimes to consumers and businesses and is the fastest growing white-collar crime in America, according to the Federal Trade Commission. Not too long ago, I was a victim of identity theft. I understand the frustration, fear, and sense of hopelessness that many feel when learning that a criminal has stolen their identity. I was a victim during the 2015 filing season. A criminal stole my personal information and filed a return with my name, my wife's name, or social security numbers, and other personal information. The thieves even had a W-2 form from the United States Congress that contained a fake version of my information. I didn't learn about this fraud until I received an IRS notice questioning a return I had filed, even though I hadn't yet filed. Each year, thousands of families try to resolve this same sort of headache, have to prove to the federal government they are who they say they are. That included me, right along with everyone else creating the tremendous call volume the IRS receives on a given day. I had to go through that same process. People thought, wow, you had to go through the same thing? And I said, yes, I did. That's when I realized there should be a single point of contact at the IRS for Americans dealing with identity theft. This common sense legislation will simply require the IRS to establish a single point of contact at the IRS for taxpayers who have been impacted by identity theft. This will help everyday Americans who have had to deal with the stress and inconvenience of having their identity stolen get the service they deserve from the IRS. I'm committed to helping all Americans that are victims of identity fraud. I will continue to leverage my experience to come up with safeguards to prevent others from going through what too many Americans like myself have experienced in recent years. This bill will greatly help to better serve taxpayers from the hardships caused by tax-related identity theft. I again appreciate the chairman, his staff, and all of my colleagues for working with me on this important issue. I encourage support for this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Renacci. I'll now turn to Mr. Lewis for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope that all of our colleagues will support the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5439. I'm very, very proud to join my good friend, Mr. Renacci from Ohio, in sponsoring this common sense bill. We share a passion and a commitment to this issue. We previously worked on the ID theft and introduced the Stolen Identity Fraud Prevention Act. I'm proud to join him again. Today, our bill continued this good work by requiring the IRS to establish a single point of contact for victims of tax-related identity theft. I also include this common sense policy in the Taxpayer Protection Act of 2017. This bill will help ease the frustration felt by victims of tax-related identity theft, and it will ensure that they receive the help and support they need and deserve. This is a good taxpayer service bill, and I hope all of our colleagues will support it. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Pascrell, for what purposes? In just a moment, if you would.
Thank you.
So we'll now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5439 without objection. Measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time I offer an amendment in nature substitute, which is distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in nature substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Bartold, Staff Director for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment, nature substitute, with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask the members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 25 and JCX 26, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. This legislation would require that the Secretary establish within the Internal Revenue Service a team or subset of specially trained employees who can work across functions, different functions within the IRS to resolve problems for victims of identity theft, and this team would be accountable for handling the case of that identity theft victim to its completion. This team would serve as a single point of contact for the taxpayer who's affected by identity theft. This proposal, the legislation, would be effective upon the date of enactment. That concludes my brief description. I'd be happy to provide more detailed answers if required.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Bartold. Are there any questions about the amendment in nature substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Pascrell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I introduced a bill last Congress, the Identity Theft and Tax Fraud Prevention Act. Sounds right. Included a provision creating a single point of contact for identity theft victims at the IRS. I thought that it was a comprehensive way to look at it. I'm pleased to see this provision moving forward as a standalone piece of legislation. Victims of tax-related identity theft express frustration with the need to repeatedly contact the IRS about their case and explain their situation to multiple IRS employees. Having a single point of contact, I believe, is a common sense solution so that identity theft victims can speak to one IRS representative who tracks their case. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pascrell. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute? If there are none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 5439 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill, H.R. 5439 is amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The opinion chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 5439 is amended as ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 5443 to require mandatory electronic filing for exempt organizations. I now return the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Kelly, to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, happy birthday. First, I want to thank Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy for co-sponsoring this legislation with me. This bill, in short, would ensure that all nonprofits file their tax forms electronically. Today, approximately 60% of all 990s are filed electronically, but the remaining 40% are still paper filed and not released as open data. This bill would change that by making e-filing of the 990 form mandatory for tax-exempt organizations. This provision is identical to the one that my friend Congressman Blumenauer and I introduced in a larger tax package, the Charity Act, along with Senators Thune and Casey on Senate Finance in 2017. In addition to requiring tax-exempt organizations to file their tax forms electronically, it would provide for making such returns available to the public in a machine-readable format. Why is this important? Well, better 990 information, when searchable and available to the public, allows for better scrutiny and transparency. As a result, it will help reduce fraud and improve efficiency and accuracy. By promoting better transparency among nonprofits, it will make it easier to catch bad actors who are using donations for personal benefit. Electronic filing, or e-filing, is not only more efficient and also costs taxpayers less and the IRS less, it also serves as a highly effective tool in exposing such scam charities. Let me give you an example. In 2015, the Federal Trade Commission, the District of Columbia, and all 50 of our states filed a lawsuit against 4 scam cancer charities calling themselves the Cancer Fund. Their owners had used over 95% of the $187 million in charitable donations for their personal benefit. This lawsuit took 4 years to develop because of the limitations of analyzing thousands and thousands of pages of data that were filed on paper. What we're talking about is hundreds of millions of dollars that were given by generous and caring citizens. They think they were donating this for the use that was expressed. They thought they were helping to cure cancer. To take that money away from these cancer patients is not only wrong, it's immoral. Think about this. Congress, or charges could have been brought against these scam charities in less than 1 year instead of 4 years if the return information had been available electronically. There's countless examples that prove this is the case. The state of Michigan is a great model for just how valuable access to machine-readable data is. Michigan has shut down the most number of scam nonprofits out of all our 50 states. This is because of the Michigan Attorney General's ability to analyze searchable data. This bipartisan bill will help expose these fraudsters by ensuring that nonprofits are e-filing annual returns. And I urge all my colleagues to support this anti-fraud bill. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I'll now turn to Mr. Lewis, original co-sponsor of the bill, for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope that all of our colleagues will support the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5443. This bill would require tax-exempt organizations to file their annual information returns electronically. It will save money and time. The bill will also allow the IRS to grant a 2-year delay of this requirement for small organizations. This is a good, sound policy, and I hope that all of our colleagues will support this simple and necessary bill. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. We'll now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5443 without objection. The measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time I offer an amendment in nature substitute which was distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in nature substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Bartold, Staff Director for Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in nature substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask the members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have before you 2 joint committee documents, JCX 27 and JCX 28, that describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. Under present law, there's a requirement that certain exempt organizations file return information electronically, and as a general matter, it is only the largest or the smallest tax-exempt organizations that are required to file these annual information returns. This legislation would extend the requirement to e-file to all tax-exempt organizations required to file statements or returns in the Form 990 series or the Form 8872 series, which applies to political organization report on contributions and expenditures. And the proposal also then requires that the Internal Revenue Service make this information available to the public in machine-readable form. The proposal is generally effective for organizations' taxable years beginning after the date of enactment, but in the case of certain smaller organizations, the effective date is delayed. That concludes my brief description of this legislation. Be happy to answer any detailed questions that the members might have.
Thank you, Mr. Bartold. Are there any questions about the amendment, the nature of substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson.
Mr.
Purpose
Chairman,
of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 5443 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 5443 is amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5443 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical conforming changes to the bill and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is a bill from Mr. Pascrell, H.R. 4403, to amend the Tariff Act of 1930 to protect personally identifiable information. I now recognize Subcommittee Chairman Reichert for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased that we are considering H.R. 4403, the Moving Americans Privacy Protection Act, as a part of today's markup. It's common sense, it's bipartisan, and will help protect personal information such as Social Security numbers and passport numbers that are transmitted on vessel manifests to U.S. Customs and Border Protection. CBP, as it's called, is required by law to make certain manifest data available to the public, even though personal information is not required to be on the manifest. Carriers sometimes include it, though. This is particularly true in the case of international household moves that are done in connection with military deployments, foreign service assignments, and other government employee transitions. While CBP maintains procedures for individuals to request confidential treatment of their personal information, that data is sometimes inadvertently made available to the public. But personal information, even when erroneously included on a manifest by a carrier, should never be disclosed publicly. This puts Americans at risk for identity theft and credit card fraud. This bill will help solve this problem by requiring CBP to ensure that such personal information is no longer disclosed. By moving this legislation, we can take concrete steps to better protect the personally identifiable information of all Americans. I would like to personally thank Congressman Denham for his hard work, and especially Congressman Bill Pascrell for authoring this important legislation. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Reichert. I now recognize the bill's sponsor, Mr. Pascrell, for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak today, excuse me, in support of Moving Americans Privacy Protection Act, which would require that the U.S. Customs and Border Protection ensures that personally identifiable information is not publicly disclosed during an international household move. So, Customs is currently required to adequately, excuse me, protect personally identifiable information that is provided on, among other things, international shipping documents. So in order to fulfill the mandate, the Customs currently maintains procedures that allow shippers to request confidential treatment of certain information. However, it can often take Customs several months to make a determination on such a request. Some determinations are not even made until after the information has already been publicly disclosed. Got a problem here. As a result, personally identifiable information has been mistakenly disclosed to the public. This impact has been acutely felt by the U.S. civil servants and military personnel, which make up a large percentage of international household moves. So disclosing this information has increased the risks that individuals may be the victims of identity theft and credit card fraud. In my view, the current system at Customs is not working as well as it could or should. I also do not believe that individuals should bear the burden of making a proactive request to the Customs to ensure that their personally identifiable information is not publicly disclosed. We should be able to expect that our government will protect such sensitive information, not only for the military, but for everybody. This bill is intended to rectify the problems by mandating that Customs put in place a proactive system that will prevent personally identifiable information from being made public. In closing, I call on my colleagues to support this common sense legislation that has support on both sides of the aisle. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Find the button first. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 4403. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of an amendment. I will now turn to Angela Ellard, the Chief Trade Counsel for the committee, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after her presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment in the nature of a substitute amends Section 431 of the Tariff Act of 1930 to require U.S. Customs and Border Protection to ensure that certain personally identifiable information, such as Social Security numbers and passport numbers, is removed from any manifest that is signed, produced, delivered, or electronically transmitted before the manifest is made available to the public. The legislation also provides a 30-day effective period to allow CBP time to program its systems to identify and remove this information. Finally, the amendment in the nature of a substitute makes technical and other changes so that the provisions can work in conformity with underlying law.
Thank you. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Green tip. Okay. The question is on favorable reporting the bill, H.R. 4403 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 4403 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental additional dissenting or minority views. I got to back up. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 4403 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Okay, now the question is on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 4403 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 4403 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental additional dissenting or minority views.
You got to find the right page.
You got to move that stuff. Thanks, Dave. Our next order of business, thank you, Mr. Reichert. Our next order of business is H.R. 1512, Social Security Child Protection Act. I recognize Mr. Martin for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks for considering this very important piece of legislation, and the whole committee for recognizing how important protecting a child's Social Security number can be. So, a few years ago, I had a frantic call from a constituent one morning. She had just recently had a baby and was expecting the Social Security card for that baby to be in the mail. Very much to their dismay, they found out that there had been a ring of people going and removing mail from mailboxes in the community. And in fact, after several weeks of investigation, the postal office and the local authorities discovered a whole pile of mail in the possession of a convicted felon. In that pile of mail was this child's, less than a year-old child's, Social Security number. So we began to work on this issue. Mr. Johnson had some hearings in Plano. We had hearings, several hearings on this, and we had never been able to secure the cooperation of the Social Security Administration in making a ruling that something like this, if it happened, would be able, the Social Security number would be able to be replaced. Most people don't realize it, but many children have their identity stolen and do not realize it for many years, because a child usually does not start using their Social Security number till age 13 or 14 when they get their first job. So it's a very, this child's Social Security number is easy pickings for criminals to go out and use for years. And in fact, some children's parents find out that their identity has been stolen, and they've been working jobs at age 7 and 8. And so it's obvious that they have had their identity stolen. I'd like to thank Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett was an original co-sponsor on this bill. This bill basically says that if the parent can prove that the Social Security number was stolen or in the U.S. mail system, that the Social Security Administration would be obligated at that point to issue a new card to the parent and to the child. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Martin. I now recognize Mr. Doggett for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I mainly want to acknowledge the initiative that Mr. Marchant took on this measure. I think it's a constructive measure. A number of years ago, I authored and passed through the House a measure concerning the removal of this information on Medicare. The Senate never acted. Mr. Johnson picked that bill up the next session, and we worked together. And finally, after years, I think in May or June, the Social Security Administration, Medicare folks finally got together, and the cards start coming out to seniors to try to protect their privacy. And what Mr. Marchant did was to identify another area that's important to protect privacy for our children. I note that Carnegie Mellon did a study that said that nearly 10% of children have had their identity stolen, and that's significantly higher actually than for adults. I think children are particularly vulnerable to this practice, and I salute Mr. Marchant for recognizing that, and I'm pleased to join him in supporting this legislation. Children and their parents and their guardians acting on their behalf deserve this streamlined process that will allow for a child to be issued a new Social Security card, Social Security number and card long before any misuse occurs. No child should have to wait for the inevitable harm to come of their identity being stolen before they can take action. Building on the success that we've had for seniors, we now, through Mr. Marchant's bill, work to ensure on a bipartisan basis that we provide the same type of protection for infants and children from these baseless identity thieves. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1512, Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time I offer an amendment in the nature of substitute which was distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. Now I'll turn to Amy Stewart, the Staff Director for Social Security Subcommittee, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after her presentation. Ms. Stewart. Can you hit that microphone?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 1512 seeks to protect children under the age of 14 from the effects of identity theft by requiring the Social Security Administration to issue a new Social Security number to any child under the age of 14 when that child's Social Security card has been stolen while being mailed to his or her address. The Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute makes technical and clarifying changes, including creating an effective date for the bill of 180 days following enactment. Chairman Brady, that concludes my walkthrough, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Stewart. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Schweikert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is just a comment, compliment, and some appreciation both to the bill sponsors, being the father of a 2.5-year-old. I do want, though, as this conversation moves forward, this legislation accomplishes substantially what you're after. But I will tell you, I believe that there's also some technology solutions in a distributive ledger model, blockchain model, that would actually, we need to start thinking about moving forward a mechanism for Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, veterans, all these where we have identifying numbers. Because if it's maybe Social Security fraud for my 2-year-old daughter, and stealing that number, but also we see that there's fraud in medical services and other types of identifiers out there. And there is some technology that can rotate and blind the number and may be more universal across all these types of services that exist in our society. So I'd like us to think that accomplish this, but also we need to all be getting together and looking for a technology solution that takes us into the future. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Johnson, recognize strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I first want to thank my fellow Texas colleagues, Mr. Marchant and Mr. Doggett, for their work on this important legislation. This bill is just common sense. Children who have their Social Security card and number stolen before it even gets to them deserve to be able to get a new number, and this will help these youngest of victims of identity theft. It's the right thing to do. I encourage my colleagues to support this common sense legislation. But, colleagues, the fact is that this doesn't fix the real problem. It's time to have a serious conversation about the use of Social Security numbers. Remember, the original purpose of these numbers was to track earnings for the purpose of determining Social Security benefits. As we know, these numbers are used for everything in the world nowadays. Mr. Chairman and colleagues, the American people deserve nothing less than having a serious conversation about the Social Security number, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. Ms. Black, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is such an important issue. With having 6 grandchildren, I am acutely aware that we have to protect these children. The FTC, the lead agency, federal agency on identity theft, this is amazing, reported 400,000 complaints of identity theft in 2017 alone. And almost 30% of those increases came from 2013. And the Social Security number, as we all know, has become an increasingly valuable target for identity theft due to its widespread use throughout the financial sector. Children are particularly vulnerable to Social Security theft because they do not work, drive, or establish credit, thereby extending the time an identity theft can misabuse a child's Social Security number before being noticed or causing harm. So currently, before a Social Security number can be issued, Social Security Administration policy requires that a person not only show that their Social Security number has been misused by the third party, but also that he or she was harmed by that misuse. And I'm proud to sponsor this bill that allows our young children to get a fresh start with a new Social Security number without having to be harmed by the misuse of a stolen Social Security number. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Black. Mr. Marshall, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to submit for the record an article from The Hill entitled "Why Children Are Now Prime Targets for Identity Theft," and a letter from the Association of Mature American Citizens and AARP in support of this bill. Thank you.
Without objection. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. In the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 1512 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill, H.R. 1512 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, no. In the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 1512 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next and final order of business is H.R. 5192, the Protecting Children from Identity Theft Act. I recognize Mr. Curbelo for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Brady and Ranking Member Neal, for bringing this bill, the Protecting American Children from Identity Theft Act, before the committee today. And thank you, Congressman Marchant, for being my partner on the legislation and for all your work to bring this legislation to the committee. Unfortunately, my district in South Florida is very familiar with the lengths to which fraudsters will go through to steal the identity of a child. The fact that children's identities and personal information are being stolen 50 times more than adults cannot continue unaddressed. The Government Accountability Office describes synthetic identity fraud as involving the creation of a fictitious identity by using a combination of real data, like Social Security number or date of birth, from multiple individuals and fabricated information. Today, synthetic identity fraud accounts for 80% of all credit card fraud. TransUnion says a record $355 million in outstanding credit card balances was owed by people who it suspects didn't exist in 2017, up more than 8-fold from 2012. Synthetic identity fraud usually preys on children and immigrants. In the long run, it oftentimes damages their credit history, making it more difficult for them to get approved for a mortgage or a credit card later in life. We can do more to protect children and immigrants from identity theft. Through creative proposals like the bill we are considering today, we can protect the identity of individuals by leveraging new technologies to simplify the verification system. H.R. 5192, the Protecting Children from Identity Theft Act, directs the Social Security Administration to accept electronic signatures when financial institutions want to verify their customers' information. Currently, firms may seek verification 1 name and Social Security number at a time, or up to 10 at a time. The creditor must be in physical possession of the signed consent form SSA-89 or so-called wet signature prior to requesting Social Security number verifications. Mr. Chairman, the goal of this bill is to change the outdated inefficiencies of the current system. The SSA provides important services and benefits that millions of Americans rely on. This bill protects the SSA's ability to do its important work by requiring the users to cover all costs, both direct and indirect, of this new system. Under this bill, the SSA Commissioner is not allowed to begin development of the new verification system until the Commissioner determines that at least 50% of the program's startup costs have been covered by users. If the SSA temporarily uses IT modernization funds, the Commissioner is required to fully recover those funds through user fees. After initial development, users of the verification system are obligated to pay for the ongoing costs associated with this new workload by way of advances, reimbursements, user fees, or other recoveries as determined by the Commissioner. These users are financial institutions, by the way. Identity theft is an issue that affects each of our districts. We need efficient solutions that can help protect our children's identities from bad actors. This bill is a step in the right direction. I encourage all of the members of this committee to vote in favor of H.R. 5192, the Protecting Children from Identity Theft Act, to help modernize identity protections for children all across our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'll now recognize Mr. Larson for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and happy birthday to you as well, and echoing the sentiments of people here today. I also guess, and I want to recognize the incredible work of Representative Corbello on this, as well as our esteemed colleague Kirsten Sinema, and in so many respects, based on what we heard from both Mr. Marchant and Mr. Doggett, how this is can be viewed as a companion bill in many respects in protecting Social Security. This bipartisan legislation builds on an existing tool that the Social Security Administration already offers to the private sector to help combat identity theft. The tool allows qualified entities such as banks to verify with Social Security that the name, the number of a potential customer is valid and belongs to a real person. Our nation is facing a growing epidemic of so-called synthetic identity theft. This is a sophisticated form of fraud where criminals create a fake identity by combining a false name with a real person's Social Security number. Numbers that belong to children are especially valuable for these criminals. The bill would strengthen Social Security Administration's existing verification tool to help combat the rising problem of synthetic identity theft. It would allow certified financial service companies, if they have consent from their customer, to verify the customer's name, Social Security number, and the date of birth with the Social Security's own records. I am pleased that we are able to work in a bipartisan way and to strengthen this bill in several ways. First, we made sure that the new verification tool would not detract from the main mission of Social Security, which is to run Social Security's insurance program and make sure Americans receive their earned benefits on time and in full. The users of the new tool must pay the full cost of developing it and in conducting their verifications. Second, we strengthen the security of the system to make sure it is not subject to misuse. In addition, users of the system must ensure that they comply with the Privacy Act and other requirements of federal law in obtaining consent from their customers. As the lead Democrat on the Social Security Subcommittee, I am pleased to support this legislation, sponsored and so adequately and represented by Mr. Corbella and our associate, Kirsten Sinema, and urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. The committee will now proceed consideration of H.R. 5192. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time, I offer an amendment in nature substitute which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in nature substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Amy Shewart, the Staff Director for Social Security Subcommittee, provide the technical description of the amendment in nature substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask the members hold their questions until after her presentation. Ms. Shewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 5192, as introduced by Representative Corbello, seeks to reduce synthetic identity fraud by requiring the Social Security Administration to develop a system to match the name, Social Security number, and date of birth submitted by permitted users against the Social Security Administration's records. As described on the green sheet distributed yesterday, the Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute makes a series of technical, clarifying, and perfecting changes. These changes include referring to the Social Security number as the Social Security account number, replacing subcontractors with contractors as permitted entities, and clarifying that if the Commissioner temporarily uses funds designated for information technology modernization, that those funds must be fully reimbursed through user fees. Chairman Brady, that concludes my walkthrough, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Schroeder. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Johnson, you're recognized.
Sir. I move to strike the last words, and thank you for doing that. I want to thank Representative Kerbelow for his work on this important issue. Synthetic identity fraud is a real problem with real costs to the victims. This legislation will help stop criminals from stealing $1 billion a year by ensuring that we can verify a person is who he or she claims to be when applying for a credit card. While Social Security will provide this service, the users will pay the full cost. It's important to note that Social Security's budget will not be impacted by this new service. Social Security has an important job to make sure that those who are eligible get the benefits they deserve. This legislation is the best way to stop synthetic identity fraud. Social Security needs to act very quickly to set up this new system and ensure that it is easy to use. The American people deserve nothing less, and I'm committed to doing everything I can to protect all Americans from identity theft. And I urge all my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of substitute. All those in favor, Mr. Larson. Okay, sure. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purposes of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 5192 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Question is on favorability reporting the bill H.R. 5192 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Being chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 5192 is amended. Is ordered favorably reported to the House. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Who requested a roll?
Right there. Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Nunez. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith in Nebraska. Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black. Aye. Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci. Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan. Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome. Mr. Holding. Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith, Missouri. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice. Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert. Yes. Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Wolarski. Ms. Wolarski, aye. Mr. Curbello. Mr. Curbello, aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood, aye. Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis, aye. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, aye. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, aye. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kind. Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell, aye. Mr. Crowley. Mr. Crowley, aye. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, aye. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, aye. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, aye. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, aye. Ms. Del Bene? Ms. Del Bene, aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, aye. Mr. Reed? Ms. Nome? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report the vote.
38 ayes, 0 nays.
On this vote, the ayes are 38 and noes are 0. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 5192 is amended. It's ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives without objection. Ask the staff be authorized to make technical conforming changes. Bill, the members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Chairman Jenkins, Ranking Member Larson, all the members who contributed to this, a very good bipartisan work today. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.